Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets, the second epic novel by Dav Pilkey. The Top Secret Truth About Captain Underpants by George Beard and Harold Hutchins, who deny everything. Once upon a time, there were two cool kids named George and Harold. We are cool. Me too. They made their own comics about a superhero named Captain Underpants. Tra-la-la. Everybody thought their comics were funny. Ha 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 ha. Except for their mean old principal, Mr. Krupp. Blah blah blah. One time Mr. Krupp was being mean to George and Harold. Blah blah blah. So they bought the 3D hypno-ring. They hypnotized Mr. Krupp. I will obey. Then they turned him into Captain Underpants. But Mr. Krupp thought he really was Captain Underpants. He jumped out the window to fight crime. Uh-oh, tra-la-la. George and Harold tried to stop him, but they had to save the world first. Kaboom! When they got back to school, George poured water on Captain Underpants' head. He turned back into Mr. Krupp, but something else was wrong. Blah, blah, blah. Because now, for some strange reason, every time Mr. Krupp hears somebody snap their fingers, he turns back into Captain Underpants. Tra-la-la. So whatever you do, please don't snap your fingers around Mr. Krupp. Please, 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 don't snap those fingers. This has been a public service announcement from George and Harold, who still deny everything. The end. Chapter 1. George and Harold. This is George Beard and Harold Hutchins. George is the kid on the left with the tie and the flat top. Harold is the one on the right with the t-shirt and the bad haircut. Remember that now. Joe's Furniture. Come in and see our pretty armchairs. Depending on who you asked, you'd probably hear a lot of different things about George and Harold. Their teacher, Miss Ribble, might say that George and Harold are disruptive and behaviorally challenged. Their gym teacher, Mr. Mina, might add that they were in serious need of a major attitude adjustment. The principal, Mr. Krupp, would probably have a few more choice words to include, like sneaky and criminally mischievous. And I'll get those boys if it's the last thing well, you get the idea. But if you ask their parents, they'd probably tell you that George and Harold were smart and sweet and very good-hearted, even if they were a bit silly at times. I'd have to agree with their parents. But even so, their silliness did get them into a lot of trouble sometimes. In fact, it once got them into so much trouble they accidentally almost destroyed the whole planet with an army of evil, vicious talking toilets. But before I can tell you that story, I have to tell you this story. Chapter 2. This story. One fine morning at Jerome Horwitz's elementary school, George and Harold had just gotten out of the 4th grade remedial gym class when they saw a big sign in the hallway. It was an announcement for the 2nd annual INVENTION convention. George and Harold had fond memories of last year's INVENTION convention, but this year's convention was a bit different. The first prize winner got to be principal for the day. Wow, said George. "Whoever gets to be principal gets to make up all the rules for the whole day, and everybody in the school has to follow those rules." "We have got to win first prize this year," exclaimed Harold. Just then George and Harold's principal, Mr. Krupp, showed up. "Aha!" he shouted. "I'll bet you two are up to no good." "Not really," said George. "We're just reading about this year's contest." "Yeah," said Harold. "We are going to win first prize in the contest and be principals for the day." "Ha ha ha ha!" laughed Mr. Krupp. "Do you honestly think I'd let you two enter this year's contest after that stunt you pulled at last year's invention convention?" George and Harold smiled and thought back to the first annual invention convention. Chapter 3: The Flashback. It was about 1 year earlier, and all of the faculty and students of Jerome Horwitz Elementary School had gathered in the gymnasium for what would later be known as the sticky chair incident. George and Harold stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," said George, "Harold and I have invented something that is guaranteed to keep you all glued to your seats." "Yes," said Harold, "we call it glue." Mr. Krupp became very angry. "You two did not invent glue," he shouted. He stood up to take the microphone away from Harold, and his chair stood up with him. Everyone in the gymnasium laughed. The school secretary, Miss Inthrope, stood up to help remove Mr. Krupp's chair from his pants. Her chair stood up with her too. Everyone in the gymnasium laughed harder. The other teachers stood up, and you guessed it, they stuck to the chairs as well. Everyone in the audience howled with laughter. One kid stood up to go to the bathroom, and his chair came up with him also. The audience stopped laughing so hard. They all quickly checked the chairs, and suddenly the laughter stopped completely. Everyone in the whole school was glued to the seats. You see, while it was true that George and Harold had not invented glue, they had invented a new kind of glue by simply mixing rubber cement with concentrated orange juice mix that created a quick-drying, body heat activated glue. Then they applied this special glue to every seat in the gymnasium except theirs early that morning. Everybody in the gymnasium was glaring at George and Harold and seething with anger. "I've got a good idea," said George. "What?" asked Harold. "Run!" cried George. George and Harold were grinning from ear to ear, remembering their silly invention and the chaos that followed. "Yeah, that was hilarious," laughed Harold. "Yeah," chuckled George, "it'll be hard to top that this year." "Well, you won't get a chance this year," said Mr. Krupp. He took out a magnifying glass and held it up to the fine print on the sign. "This contest is open to all students in the 3rd and 4th grades except George Beard and Harold Hutchins." "You mean we can't enter the contest?" asked Harold. "It's worse than that," laughed Mr. Krupp. "You boys can't even attend this year's convention. I'm putting you two in study hall that whole day." Mr. Krupp turned and walked away, laughing victoriously. "Rats," said Harold. "What are we going to do now?" "Well," said George, "you know the old saying, if you can't join 'em, beat 'em." Chapter 4: The Invention. Early that evening George and Harold sneaked back to school with the supplies. They crept into the gymnasium and peeked around. "I think somebody's still in here," whispered Harold. "Oh, it's just Melvin's needly," said George. Melvin was the school brainiac. He was busy putting some last-minute touches on his new invention for the contest. "We should wait here until he leaves," whispered Harold. "No way," said George. "He could be here all night. Let's just go over and talk to him." When Melvin saw George and Harold approaching, he was not happy. "Oh no," he said. "I'll bet you guys are here to mess with everybody's inventions." "Nice guess," said George. "Listen, we promise not to mess with your invention if you promise not to tell anybody that you saw us here tonight." Melvin looked lovingly at his invention and reluctantly agreed. "I promise," he said. "Great," said George. "Say, what is that invention of yours anyway? It just looks like a photocopy machine." "Well, it used to be a photocopy machine," said Melvin, "but I've made some major adjustments to it. Now it is an invention that will revolutionize the world. I call it the Patsy 2000. "It will revolutionize the world, and you name it Patsy?" asked Harold. "Yes," said Melvin. "PATSY is an acronym for Photoatomic Transmom Globulating Yak Tofan Trip Plutonic Zanziptomizer." "I'm sorry I asked," said Harold. "Allow me to demonstrate," said Melvin. "The Patsy 2000 can take any one-dimensional image and create a living, breathing, three-dimensional copy of that image. For example, take this ordinary photograph of a mouse." Melvin placed the photo of the mouse onto the glass screen of the Patsy 2000 and pressed start. The lights in the gymnasium dimmed as all the power in the entire school seemed to get sucked into the Patsy 2000. Soon the machine began to vibrate and hum loudly, and tiny bolts of static electricity snapped out from underneath. "I hope that thing doesn't explode," said Harold. "Oh, this is nothing," said Melvin. "Should have seen how the Patsy 2000 reacted when I copied a poodle." Finally, after a series of flashes and loud zaps, everything stopped. A small ding was heard. Then a tiny mouse crawled out the side door of the Patsy 2000 and onto the floor. "Isn't it wonderful?" exclaimed Melvin. George inspected the mouse closely. "That's a great trick," George laughed. "You really had me going for a while." "It's not a trick," cried Melvin. "The Patsy 2000 really does bring photos to life. I even created living creatures from paintings and drawings." "Yeah, right," laughed Harold. "And I thought we were con artists." George and Harold walked away chuckling. It was time to move on to bigger and better things. Chapter 5. Bigger and Better Things. George and Harold went to the other end of the gymnasium, opened the backpacks, and began to work. George busied himself by turning all the spray nozzles on the automatic dog washer around, while Harold filled up the soap tank with India ink. When they moved on to the volcano detector, "Will you please pass me the big bag of butterscotch pudding and a Phillips head screwdriver?" asked Harold. "Sure," said George as he carefully inserted eggs into the electric ping-pong ball server. Chapter 6. The Invention Convention. The following day started out sunny and cheerful. The students and faculty filed into the gymnasium and checked the seats very carefully before sitting down. "Greetings," said Mr. Krupp, standing up at the microphone. "You don't need to worry about sticky seats today," he said. "I've taken measures to ensure that this invention convention won't be a disaster like last year's." Everyone settled in as Madison Mancini, a third grader, stepped on stage to demonstrate her automatic dog washer. "First," said Madison, "you put your dog in the tub. Then you press this button." Madison pressed the start button. At first nothing happened. Then suddenly a spurt of inky black water sprayed up. And out of the crowd, everyone except the dog got soaked as Madison tried desperately to turn off the sprayers. "I can't stop it," she cried. "Someone turned all the nozzles around." "Now who could have done that?" asked Mr. Krupp. Next up was the Donny Schaumeier with his electric ping-pong ball server. He turned the machine on, and immediately it began hurling extra-large grade A eggs into the crowd. Poop, 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 poop went the machine. Splat, 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 splat went the eggs. "I can't run the machine off," cried Donny. "Somebody jammed a paper clip onto the controller." "Now who could have done that?" asked Miss Ribble. Freddie Moore's volcano detector was also a big flop, and Freddie connected the circuits to the 9-volt battery, a large spring, which had been crammed into the center of his miniature volcano, launched a giant plastic bag of butterscotch pudding high into the crowd. It landed somewhere between the third and fourth rows. Splat! "Hey!" whined Freddie. "Somebody put pudding in my volcano." "Now who could have done that?" asked Mr. Meaner. The rest of the day went on much the same way, with people shouting everything from "Hey, who put oatmeal in my solar-powered leaf blower?" to "Hey, who let all the mice out of my treadmill dune buggy?" It wasn't long before everyone fled the gymnasium, and the second annual Invention Convention had to be called off. "How could this have happened?" cried Mr. Krupp as he wiped chocolate syrup, pencil shavings, and cream of mushroom soup off his face and shirt. "George and Harold have been in study hall all day long. I put them there myself." Excuse me, Mr. Krupp," said Melvin sneakily. "I think I have an answer to your question." Chapter 7. Busted. Crash went the door to the study hall room. Mr. Krupp stomped in like a crazy person. George and Harold had never seen him this upset before. "You boys are in so much trouble," Mr. Krupp shouted. "I'm putting you two on permanent detention for the rest of the school year." "Wait a second," cried George. "You can't prove anything." "Yeah," cried Harold. "We've been here all day." Mr. Krupp smiled devilishly and looked toward the door. "Oh, Melvin," he called. Melvin Sneedly stepped into the room covered in mustard, eggshells, and shredded coconut. "They did it," Melvin said, pointing at George and Harold. "I saw him last night in the gym." "Melvin!" cried George, horrified. "You promised." "I changed my mind," Melvin said, grinning smugly. "Have fun in detention." Chapter 8. The Invention Convention Detention. After school, Mr. Krupp ushered George and Harold into the detention room and wrote a long sentence on the chalkboard. "From now on," growled Mr. Krupp, You boys will spend 2 hours a day after school copying this sentence over and over. I want every chalkboard board in this room filled completely." On his way out the door, Mr. Crop turned and said with an evil grin, "And if either of you leaves this room for any reason, I'm going to suspend you both." Now, as you might have guessed, writing sentences was nothing new to George and Harold. The two boys waited until Mr. Crop left the room, when they each took out 4 homemade wooden rods out their backpacks. The rods had holes in them that George and Harold had drilled in George's dad's wood shop. George screwed the rods together, while Harold inserted a piece of chalk into each hole. Then they each took a pole and began copying Mr. Crop's sentence. Every time they wrote one sentence, the wooden poles made 12. After about 3.5 minutes, every chalkboard in the room was completely filled. George and Harold sat down and admired their work. "We've got a lot of time on our hands now," said George. "Got any ideas?" "Let's make a new comic book," said Harold. So the two boys took out some paper and pens and created an all-new adventure about their favorite superhero. It was called Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. Chapter 9. Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets, by George Beard and Harold Hutchins. Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. Story by George Beard. Pictures by Harold Hutchins. One day at school, everything was pretty normal. The lunch ladies were serving toasted rat sandwiches, the principal was yelling, blah, 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 and the gym teacher was being mean to everybody. "My grandma can run faster than you guys." Then a UFO appeared. It zapped the school with an evil ray. The ray made all of the toilets come to life. It made them evil too. The toilets were hungry. "Yum, yum, eat 'em up," said the gym teacher. "Help! The toilets just scratched somebody's car and ate up the gym teacher." "What a mercy! Was it my car?" "This looks like a job for Crash Captain Underpants." Captain Underpants ran to the storage room. "Yum, yum, eat 'em up." He found a bunch of plungers. He put them in the toilets. Their mouths got stuck. Tra-la-la! Hooray for Captain Underpants! Now to stop that evil UFO. Captain Underpants went outside and saw the UFO. It opened up. Click! And out jumped the terrible Turbo Toilet 2000. "I'll flush you." They had a big fight. Captain Underpants was faster than a speeding waistband, more powerful than boxer shorts. Kick! Tra-la-la! And able to leap tall buildings without getting a wedgie. Captain Underpants snuck up behind the Turbo Toilet 2000 and gave him a wedgie. Wedgie power! Ouchie! Then he hung the TT2000 to a stop sign and pulled back hard. Stretch! Then he let go. Twang! Kaboom! The spaceship blew up and all the toilets returned to normal. Hooray! Even the gym teacher escaped. Oh man. The end. Chapter 10. A Big Mistake. George and Harold sat together in the detention room, reading through the newest comic book and beaming proudly. "We've got to go to the office and make copies of this," said George, "so you can sell them on the playground tomorrow." "We can't," said Harold. "Don't you remember? Mr. Crop said he'd suspend us if he caught us leaving the room." "Then we won't let him catch us," said George. George and Harold sneaked out of the room quietly and crawled down the hall to the office. "Uh-oh," said Harold. "There's a bunch of teachers in there. We'll never get to use the copy machine." Said George. "Are there any other copy machines in this school?" "How about the one that Melvin had in the gym?" asked Harold. "Oh, yeah," said George. George and Harold crept over to the gym and found the Patsy 2000. "I wonder if this machine still makes copies," said Harold. "Melvin did say that he had made some adjustments to it." "Oh, he probably just crammed a mouse in there to fool us," said George. "It's the oldest trick in the book. I'm sure the machine will still make regular copies." George placed the cover of their new comic book face down on the glass screen and pressed start. Patsy 2000. All at once the lights in the whole school dimmed and the Patsy 2000 began to shake and clunk around wildly. Giant volts of static electricity zapped out the bottom of the machine as a great whirlwind rose from the top. The loose papers and other small objects in the room were sucked into the wind, and they spun above the machine like a raging cyclone. "I don't think it's supposed to do this," shouted George over the horrible noise. Finally, after a series of flashes and loud zaps, the noise, wind, and sparks stopped altogether. The only sound that could be heard was of something groaning and clawing about inside the bloated, battered frame of the Patsy 2000. "It sounds like something's alive inside there," said Harold. George snatched the comic book from the top of the machine. "Let's get out of here," he cried. Just then a small ding was heard, and a full-sized, shiny white toilet emerged from the side of the Patsy 2000. Its teeth were sharp and jagged, and its angry eyeballs glowed with red, swelling veins. "Yum, yum, eat 'em up!" cried the evil toilet. Almost immediately another talking toilet emerged, followed by another, and together and another. "Yum, yum, eat 'em up!" they cried. Oh no! Melvin was right! The photoatomic transmogobulating ectophantripluton-tonic Zanziptomizer really does create living, breathing, three-dimensional copies of one-dimensional images. Harold cried convoluted,ly. "I've got an idea," said George. "What?" asked Harold. "Run!" cried George. Chapter 11. The Invention, Convention, Detention, Suspension. George and Harold screamed and ran out the gym door, closing it tightly behind them. "Aha!" yelled Mr. Krupp, who was just coming down the hall. "You boys left the detention room. You know what that means, don't you?" "It wasn't our fault," cried Harold. "Too bad," Mr. Krupp shouted with delight. "You boys are officially suspended." "Wait," cried George. "You've got to listen. Behind this door is an army of evil, vicious talk." "I don't have to listen to you boys ever again," laughed Mr. Krupp. "Now get your stuff and get out of this school." But Harold stammered, "You don't understand." "Get out!" Mr. Krupp screamed. George and Harold groaned and walked to their lockers to collect their stuff. "Gosh," said Harold, "in one day we've gotten a detention, a suspension, and we've created an army of evil talking toilets want to take over the world." "That's a pretty bad day, even by our standards," said George. "Oh well," said Harold, "I just hope things don't get any worse." Chapter 12. Things Get Worse. "Let's spread quickly throughout the office that George and Harold had been suspended. The teachers rushed out to cheer and laugh at the two boys. "You're in big trouble now," chuckled Miss Anthrope. "I can't wait to call your parents and tell them the news." "Let's take their desks outside and chop them up," cried Miss Ribble. "Let's throw a party in the gym," shouted Mr. Meaner. "No," cried George. "Whatever you do, don't open the door to the gym." "We can do whatever we like," snarled Mr. Meaner as he dashed over to the gymnasium door. "Look, I'm opening the door." He quickly opened the gym door. "Now I'm closing the door," he said. "Now I'm opening the door again, and I'm... Ah! Glug! An evil toilet had stuck its mouth through the door, snapped Mr. Meaner up, and swallowed him whole. Flush! The talking toilets then pushed their way through the open gymnasium doors and spilled out into the hallway. "Yum, yum, eat 'em up!" the toilets bellowed. "Yum, yum, eat 'em up!" Snap! The teachers couldn't believe their eyes. They screamed and ran for their lives. Only Mr. Crump, Miss Ribble, and George and Harold remained frozen in fear. They watched paralyzed as the talking toilets came nearer and nearer. Finally, Miss Ribble pointed at the toilets and snapped her fingers. "Snap! Go away!" she cried. "Go away this minute!" But the toilets didn't listen. They moved closer and closer. Finally, Miss Ribble turned and ran. Mr. Crump, however, just stood there in a daze. George and Harold looked up at him. "Uh-oh," said Harold. "Did she just snap her fingers?" "Yep," said George. "Now we're really in trouble." As George was right, for at that moment Mr. Crump had begun to change. A silly, heroic smile came over his face as he stood defiantly before his foes. "I'll put a stop to you vile villains," he said fearlessly. "But first I need some supplies." Mr. Crump turned and dashed to his office. George and Harold ran after him. "Why didn't Miss Ribble have to snap her fingers?" cried Harold. "Why?" "Never mind that," cried George. "Mr. Crump is turning into Captain Underpants. We've got to pour water over his head before it's too late." Chapter 13. It's Too Late. When George and Harold reached Mr. Crump's office, they found only clothes, shoes, and toupee on the floor. "Look," said Harold, "the window is open and one of the red curtains is missing." "What do we do now?" asked George. "Do we save Captain Underpants? Or do we stay here and get eaten by a bunch of toilets?" "Let me think about that one," said Harold as he climbed out the window. George quickly collected Mr. Crump's things and shoved them into his backpack. Then he jumped out the window after Harold. The two boys slid down the flagpole and ran off after Captain Underpants. "Where does he think he's going?" asked George. "I've no idea," said Harold, "but we'd better run fast because I think we're being followed." Captain Underpants dashed through the backyards of some nearby houses and collected pairs of underwear from the clotheslines. "Mommy," said a little boy looking out his window, "a man in a red cape just stole our underwear." And now two boys are being chased by a ferocious-looking toilet with sharp, pointy teeth, screaming, "Yum, yum, eat 'em up." "Yeah, right," laughed his mother. "Just how gullible do you think I am?" Chapter 14. The Talking Toilet Takeover. When Captain Underpants was finished commandeering the underwear of local civilians, he dashed back to Jerome Horwitz's elementary to save the day. The school was now overrun with chaos. Miss Ribble came tearing out the door, followed by several evil toilets. "Help me!" she cried. "They've swallowed every teacher in the whole building except me." "Don't worry, ma'am. I won't let them eat you up," Captain Underpants said, as a toilet ate her up. "Oops," said Captain Underpants. Now only George, Harold, and Captain Underpants were left. They stood on the front lawn of the school, completely surrounded by hungry, drooling toilets. "Yum, yum, eat 'em up," the talking toilets chanted. "Yum, yum, eat 'em up. Yum, yum, eat 'em up. Yum, yum, eat 'em up." "We're doomed," cried Harold. "Never underestimate the power of underwear," cried Captain Underpants as he stretched and shot underwear into the waiting mouths of the talking toilets. Unfortunately, the toilets just swallowed the underwear whole. It only seemed to make them hungry and hungrier. "If only we could think of something that would make them really sick," said George. "Yeah," Harold continued, "something so vile and disgusting it would make them all blow their cookies and writhe in agony." Suddenly George and Harold's faces lit up. "Cafeteria food!" they shouted, and faster than a speeding waistband our three heroes dashed into the school. Chapter 15. Creamed Chipped Beef to the Rescue. George, Harold, and Captain Underpants got inside the school safely and closed the front door behind them. "I think the toilets are all outside," said George. "But not for long," said Harold. Quickly they ran to the school's kitchen and discovered a cart holding a large vat of something green and sludgy. "Yuck," said George, holding his nose. "What is that stuff?" "I think it's tomorrow's lunch," said Harold. "Perfect," said George. "I never thought I'd be glad to see creamed chipped beef." Together they wheeled the tub of stinky green glop down the hallway and out the side door of the school. Captain Underpants sat on the cart and stretched a pair of underwear over his head like a slingshot. George stood over him, scooped some cafeteria food onto the underwear, and stretched it back. Harold wheeled the car towards the talking toilets. "Tra-la-la!" shouted Captain Underpants loudly. The talking toilets turned and saw three heroes. All at once they shouted, "Yum, yum, eat 'em up!" and the chase was on. Harold pulled the cart across the playground as the toilets zipped after them. "Fire one!" cried Captain Underpants. George shot a glob of creamed chipped beef into the first toilet's mouth. The toilet swallowed it whole. Harold kept pulling as George scooped another serving into the underwear and pulled it back. "Fire two!" said Captain Underpants. Zip went the cafeteria food right into the second toilet's mouth. The whole process repeated itself until every last toilet had swallowed at least 2 servings of creamed chipped beef. "We are almost out of ammo," Captain Underpants shouted. "I don't think I can run any more," said Harold, huffing and puffing. "Don't worry. Look," said George, pointing at the toilets. They had all slowed down and were beginning to groan and wobble around. The eyes crossed and they turned an odd shade of green. "Look out!" cried Harold. "I think they're gonna hurl." And that's just what they did. George, Harold, and Captain Underpants watched as the toilets upchucked everything they had eaten during the day. The cream chipped beef, the underwear, even the teachers all came out without a scratch. Then the toilet spun around in small circles and fell to the ground dead. George checked the teachers. "They're alive," he said. "Unconscious, but alive." "Wow," said Harold. "That was easy." "Too easy," said George. "What do you mean?" asked Harold. George pulled their comic book out of his backpack and showed it to Harold. "Remember the Patsy 2000 turned everything on the front cover of our toy comic book back to life?" he asked. "Yeah, so?" said Harold. "Well," said George as he pointed to the Turbo Toilet 2000 on the front cover of the comic, "we haven't seen him yet." Chapter 16. The Turbo Toilet 2000. Suddenly, the Turbo Toilet 2000 came charging out the front door of the school with a terrible crash. The earth rumbled beneath its mighty footsteps as nearly a ton of twisting steel and raging porcelain descended upon our heroes. Crash! "You three meddling fools may have destroyed my army of talking toilets," screamed the Turbo Toilet 2000, "but you're all out of cafeteria food. How are you going to stop me?" "I'll tell you how," Captain Underpants said boldly. "With wedgie power." "Wait, Captain Underpants," cried George. "You can't fight that thing. He'll rip you to pieces." "Boys," said Captain Underpants nobly, "I must fight valiantly for truth, justice, and all that is pre-shrunk and cottony." Captain Underpants leaped onto the Turbo Toilet 2000 and the battle began. "I sure hope this doesn't lead to extremely graphic violence," said George. "Me too," said George. Chapter 7. The Extremely Graphic Violence Chapter Part 1 in FLIP-E-RAMA. Warning: the following chapter contains intense scenes showing a man in his underwear battling a giant toilet. Please do not try this at home. Introducing FLIP-E-RAMA. FLIP-E-RAMA 1. Wedgie Power versus Potty Power. Wedgie Power versus Potty Power. FLIP-E-RAMA 2. Oh no! The Potty Power Punch prevails. Oh no! The Potty Power Punch prevails. FLIP-E-RAMA 3. The carnivorous commode captures the captain. The carnivorous commode captures the captain. Chapter 18. Harold and the Purple Ballpoint Pen. Everything seemed hopeless. Captain Underpants had slipped and fallen into the mouth of the Turbo Toilet 2000, and now the giant toilet was coming after George and Harold. "Ha ha 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 ha!" laughed the powerful porcelain predator. "Once I've eaten you two kids up, I'll take over the world." "Not if we have anything to say about it," yelled George. George and Harold ran into the school and locked the door behind them. The Turbo Toilet 2000 banged against the door with its fists, shouting, "You boys can't hide in there forever." George and Harold ran to the gym. "We've got a plan," said George. "We need to invent a character who can defeat a giant robot toilet." "How about a giant robot urinal?" asked Harold. "We can call it the Urinator." "No way," said George. "They'll never let us get away with that in a children's book. We're skating on thin ice as it is." "All right," said Harold. "How about a giant plunger robot? He can carry a really big plunger and—" "That's it!" cried George. So Harold took out his purple ballpoint pen and began to draw. "Give him laser eyes," said George. "All right," said Harold, and giving turbo-atomic rocket boosters, said George. Got it, said Harold. And make him obey our every command, said George. I'm way ahead of you, said Harold. Harold finished his drawing and George inspected it carefully. This just might work, said George. Yeah, said Harold, if the Patsy 2000 can hold out. The boys turned and looked at the dented, cracked and beaten-up machine laying on its side in the corner. George and Harold pushed the Patsy 2000 upright and dusted it off. Come on, Patsy, old girl, said George. We really need you on. Yeah, said Harold. The fate of the entire planet is in our hands. Chapter 19. The Incredible Robo-Plunger. George took Harold's picture and placed it on the screen of the Patsy 2000 and pressed start. The lights around them dimmed as the weary machine began to shake and smoke. Lightning bolts zapped, thunder clapped, and the whole gymnasium shook with photo-atomic transmogobulatory ectophantriputanic xanthic energy. Come on, Patsy, George shouted over the horrible noise. You can do it, baby. Finally, a small ding was heard, and the Patsy 2000 coughed up a huge metallic behemoth. It rose up and stood valiantly before George and Harold. It was the incredible Robo-Plunger. Hooray, said George. It worked. Way to go, Patsy, Harold cheered. Now let's get outside and kick some turbo to the tushy. Chapter 20. The Extremely Graphic Violence Chapter, Part 2 in FLIP-E-RAMA. Notice, the following chapter contains terribly naughty scenes depicting a giant toilet getting its shiny hiney kicked. All toilet violence was carefully monitored by the pets, people for the ethical treatment of toilets. No actual toilets were harmed during the making of this chapter. FLIP-E-RAMA 4. The Incredible Robo-Plunger to the Rescue. FLIP-E-RAMA 5. The Incredible Robo-Plunger kicks the TT-2000's tushy. The TT-2000 takes the plunge. Chapter 21. The Aftermath. The Incredible Robo-Plunger defeated the evil Turbo Toilet 2000, but George and Harold's problems weren't over yet. They reached to the crumpled mouth of the TT-2000 and pulled out their principal. What happened here? Cried Mr. Krupp. The school had been destroyed. The teachers are all unconscious, and I'm standing here in my underwear. Uh-oh, Harold whispered. Captain Underpants must have gotten toilet water on his head. He turned back into Principal Krupp. George took Mr. Krupp's clothes and hair out of his backpack and handed them to him. I'm ruined, Principal Krupp whined as he dressed himself. I'm going to be held responsible for this mess. I'm going to lose my job. Maybe not, said George. We can fix everything and clean up this whole mess. Yeah, said George, but it will cost you. Cost me what? Asked Mr. Krupp. Well, said George, we'd like to cancel our detention and our suspension, and we'd also like to be principals for the day, said Harold. All right, said Mr. Krupp. If you can really fix everything, you've got a deal. George and Harold turned and spoke to the Incredible Robo-Plunger. All right, Robo guy, said George. Make yourself useful and pick up all this mess. Yeah, and fix up the school too, said Harold. Use your laser eyes to repair all the broken windows and stuff. And when you're done, said George, take all the evidence and fly it up to Uranus. And don't come back, said Harold. Chapter 2. To make a long story short, the robot obeyed. Chapter 23. The Aftermath. The incredible ROBO-PLUNGER soared off into space as the teachers began to regain consciousness. I just had the strangest dream, said Miss Ribble. It was all about these evil toilets who wanted to take over the world. We had the same dream too, said the other teachers. Well, said Mr. Crop, things turned out all right after all. Not quite, said George. It's payback time. Chapter 24. Principles for the day, or the Invention, Convention, Detention, Suspension, Prevention. Attention, students, said George over the intercom the following day. This is Principal George. You're all excused from classes today. There will be no homework or tests, and everybody gets an A+ for the day. That's right, said Principal Harold. Also, we are hosting an all-day recess outside, complete with free pizza, French fries, cotton candy, and a live DJ. Now go outside and play. Principal George and Principal Harold strolled out to the playground to behold their glorious domain. George got a slice of pepperoni pizza, while Harold made himself a banana split and the all-you-can-eat ice cream sundae bar. It's good to be principal, said George. Yep, said Harold. I wish we could be principals every day. Later, George and Harold paid a visit to the unfortunate folks who were spending the day writing sentences in the detention room. All the teachers were there, along with Mr. Krupp and Melvin Sneedley. Mr. Krupp looked out the window at the all-day recess celebration going on outside. How are you boys going to pay for all that ice cream and pizza? He asked. We sold some stuff, said Harold. What did you sell? Said Mr. Krupp. Your antique walnut desk and leather chair, said George, and all the furniture in the teacher's lounge. What? Screamed Mr. Krupp. I think we'd better leave now, said Harold. Snap! George and Harold left the detention room in a hurry. Miss Anthrop snapped her fingers at them. Snap! Come back here right now, she yelled. Uh-oh, said George. Did Miss Anthrop just snap her fingers? Within seconds, Mr. Krupp dashed out of the detention room and ran down the hallway toward his office. He had a goofy, heroic, all too familiar-looking smile on his face. Oh no, cried Harold. Here we go again, said George. Tra-la-la.